Imagine walking into a high-end bar, only to be laughed at and dismissed, just because of how you look. Now, what if the bartender had no idea the broke customer he just mocked was actually the CEO of the entire hotel? What happens next? Let's just say, he's in for the shock of his life. Stay tuned. Chapter 1. The mysterious guest at the bar. The Sterling Grand stood tall against the New York skyline, its golden lights reflecting off the polished glass facade. Inside, the grandeur was unmistakable: plush carpets, chandeliers dripping with crystals, and a clientele that exuded wealth. Nestled within the heart of this luxury was Noir Luxe, an upscale bar known for its impeccable service, top-shelf liquor, and strict exclusivity. At precisely 10 p.m., Jonathan Price stepped through its entrance. He wasn't dressed like the usual patrons: no tailored suits, no designer watches, a simple navy blue button-down, dark jeans, and worn leather shoes set him apart from the crowd. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and though his posture carried quiet confidence, nothing about him immediately suggested wealth or status. The jazz quartet in the corner played a soft, melancholic tune, the hum of hushed conversations filling the space. Waitstaff in crisp uniforms glided between tables, balancing expensive cocktails and vintage wines. At the bar, a man in his early 30s leaned against the polished mahogany counter, chatting idly with a guest while lazily swirling a glass of bourbon. Derek, the head bartender, exuded a polished arrogance, his white shirt pressed to perfection, vest snug against his frame. Jonathan took a seat at the bar, waiting a moment before lifting a hand slightly to get the bartender's attention. Derek barely spared him a glance before continuing his conversation. A few more seconds passed. Jonathan cleared his throat. Finally, Derek turned, arching a brow. "Can I help you?" His tone was just short of dismissive. Jonathan offered a polite nod. "Could I see the menu?" A smirk tugged at the corner of Derek's mouth as he gave Jonathan a quick once-over. Assessing the modest clothing, the absence of anything that screamed privilege, he let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You sure you're in the right place, sir?" he asked. "We don't serve house beer here." Jonathan's expression remained neutral. "I'd just like to take a look at the menu." Derek exhaled, clearly amused. He folded his arms, the condescension unmistakable in his voice. "Listen, buddy, everything here starts at $50 a glass. Nothing in your price range. Trust me." A few nearby patrons had caught the exchange. A well-dressed man at the end of the bar smirked behind his whiskey, while a woman in a silk dress cast Jonathan a fleeting look of sympathy before turning away. A young waitress standing near the service station shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flicking between Derek and the guest he was so openly dismissing. But no one spoke up. Jonathan held Derek's gaze for a long moment, as if studying him. He didn't frown, didn't scoff, didn't give any indication that he was offended. Instead, he simply nodded once, pushed his chair back, and stood. "Understood," he said calmly, before turning and walking toward the exit. Derek let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he wiped down the counter. A busboy passing by leaned in slightly and murmured, "You sure about that? What if he's someone important?" Derek scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Look at him. He's nobody." He grinned, grabbing another glass to polish. "I do this job long enough. I can spot the ones who don't belong." As Jonathan stepped out of Noir Luxe and into the grand lobby of the Sterling Grand, he glanced back once. The gleaming bar, the polished patrons, the smooth-talking bartender, they were all still caught up in their own world. He had his answer. Chapter 2. The CEO's Return. Morning light streamed through the towering windows of the Sterling Grand's executive boardroom, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table. The air inside was thick with anticipation. Seated around the table were the department heads, managers in crisp suits, some shifting uneasily in their chairs. Among them was Richard Caldwell, the hotel's general manager, his jaw tight as he flipped through a notepad. To his right sat Evelyn Grant, the head of guest services, her arms crossed as she studied the agenda. At the far end of the room, looking somewhat out of place but no less composed, was Derek, dressed in his usual noir-toned attire. He drummed his fingers against the table's surface, glancing around. sensing an odd energy in the room. He wasn't alone. Other employees from Noir Luxe were present as well, though most of them sat quietly, their eyes darting between one another. Then, the heavy doors swung open, and the room fell into an immediate hush. Jonathan Price entered, his presence commanding without a word. Gone was the casual attire from the night before. Now, he was every inch the CEO, dark-tailored suit, crisp white shirt, silver cufflinks gleaming under the overhead lights. His gaze was steady, assessing. As he took his seat at the head of the table, he allowed the silence to settle before he finally spoke. Last night, I visited Noir Luxe. A few exchanged glances. Derek's brow furrowed slightly, but he remained relaxed, oblivious to the weight of the words. Jonathan continued, his voice measured. I asked for a menu. Instead, I received a condescending remark and was dismissed by an employee. The murmurs began. Whispers spread like a slow wave, some leaning toward each other, others straightening in their seats. Richard Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn Grant pursed her lips. And then, slowly, Derek sat up a little straighter, a flicker of something crossing his face. Jonathan's gaze found him, unwavering. Do you remember me, Derek? The bartender blinked. The room was dead silent. Slowly, recognition crept into Derek's features, the color in his face draining. I'm not sure what you mean, he stammered. Jonathan leaned forward just slightly, his tone not rising, but carrying an unmistakable finality. You didn't recognize me last night, did you? Because you judged me by my appearance alone. The weight of the accusation hung in the air. Some employees shifted in their seats. Others looked to Derek, their expressions varying from discomfort to silent vindication. Lisa, standing near the back, lowered her gaze but said nothing. Jonathan straightened, turning his attention back to the rest of the table. Sterling Grand is a name associated with excellence. That excellence is not just about luxury, it's about integrity. We do not treat our guests differently based on assumptions. And yet, what I witnessed last night was a clear violation of that principle. Richard Caldwell attempted to interject. Sir, Jonathan lifted a hand, stopping him. I checked the security footage. This was not an isolated incident. His gaze swept across the table. It will not happen again. Derek opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself, but no words came. He saw it. There was no argument to make, no excuse that could undo the damage. Jonathan's tone remained calm, unwavering, effective immediately. Derek is dismissed from his position at Noir Luxe. A stunned silence followed. A few employees glanced at one another, but no one objected. Derek's chair scraped against the floor as he stood abruptly, his face contorted with a mix of humiliation and resentment. He shot a glare at Jonathan but bit back whatever words had surfaced. He turned on his heel and strode toward the door. The moment he was gone, Jonathan exhaled slightly, then refocused on the room. Moving forward, he continued, every employee in guest services will undergo immediate retraining. Noir Luxe's reputation is at stake, and I will not allow it to be compromised by arrogance or bias. His gaze settled on Lisa. Lisa, last night, I saw that you wanted to say something. I'd like to hear it now. Lisa hesitated. All eyes turned to her. She swallowed, her voice steady but careful. Derek had a habit of treating people like that. Not just you, sir. Other customers, too. We all saw it, but no one said anything because he was the kind of person who made you think speaking up wouldn't change anything. Jonathan nodded, his expression unreadable. That changes today. He turned back to the rest of the room. If any of you believe that this culture is acceptable, you may leave now. No one moved. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a quiet murmur, one voice whispering to another. Evelyn Grant leaned back, exhaling. Someone at the far end of the table rubbed the back of his neck, as if considering his own actions. Jonathan closed the meeting with one final order. Richard, I want a full plan for staff retraining on my desk by the end of the day. We are fixing this now. As the employees slowly filed out of the room, one muttered to another under his breath, he's really not messing around. And indeed, he wasn't. Chapter 3. The overhaul begins. 1 week had passed since Derek's dismissal, yet the ripples of his departure still lingered throughout Noir Luxe. Employees whispered in break rooms, some questioning whether Jonathan Price's intervention had been an overreaction, others wondering what would come next. There was an air of uncertainty, of change looming just over the horizon. That morning, Jonathan convened a meeting in the main conference room of the Sterling Grand. Unlike the formal boardroom setting from before, this was an operational meeting, meant for the people directly responsible for the day-to-day running of the hotel and, most importantly, Noir Luxe. Seated around the long oak table were the bar's senior staff, including floor supervisors, key bartenders, and waitstaff representatives. Lisa sat near the middle, hands folded in her lap. Ever since the night Jonathan had called on her to speak, she had felt something shift. She was no longer invisible, no longer just another employee in the background. Richard Caldwell stood to Jonathan's left, flipping through a thick stack of documents. Jonathan tapped a folder in front of him and cleared his throat. "I've spent the past week reviewing guest feedback, complaint logs, and security footage from the last several months," he began. His voice was steady, deliberate, commanding the room without the need for theatrics. He slid a printed report across the table. It stopped near Evelyn Grant, who picked it up and began skimming through the highlighted sections. Others craned their necks to get a glance. "Here's what I found," Jonathan continued. "An increasing number of guests at Noir Luxe have left negative feedback. Complaints about service, attitude, and preferential treatment. Some incidents were small, a delayed drink, a dismissive response, but others were blatant. Guests ignored because they didn't seem like they belonged. Patrons given worse seating, rushed service, or outright disrespect simply because they didn't meet someone's expectations of what a worthy customer should look like." A silence settled over the room. A few exchanged uneasy glances. Others looked down at their hands. Lisa remained still, listening. Jonathan let the moment linger before continuing. "That stops now, effective immediately. Every single employee in guest services, including Noir Luxe, will undergo retraining. If you wear a name tag in this hotel, you are expected to provide the same level of service to every guest who walks through those doors. There will be no exceptions." For the first time, there was movement. Some nodded slightly, while others shifted uncomfortably. Then, from the far side of the table, a voice cut through the quiet. "This is overkill." All eyes turned toward Mike, one of Noir Luxe's senior bartenders. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an expression somewhere between frustration and defiance. "We've been running this place just fine for years," he said. "You're talking about a few complaints, a few bad nights. Every business has them. We serve high-end clients. If we start treating everyone the same, we lower the bar. The regulars, the people who keep coming back because they know they'll get an exclusive experience, they're not going to like this." Jonathan regarded him for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his tone remained measured, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath his words. "You think this is about one bad night?" he asked. Mike said nothing. "This is about culture. It's about what happens when a system is left unchecked for too long." Derek didn't become Derek overnight. He felt entitled to treat guests however he wanted because he assumed no one would stop him. And he was right, because no one did. Jonathan let the weight of his words settle before adding, "So, if anyone here believes they can't adapt, if anyone thinks that this standard is too much to ask, then I will personally accept your resignation today. No hard feelings." A long pause followed. No one moved. Mike's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Lisa glanced toward him briefly, noting the way his fingers curled against his arm. There was something else there, something that went beyond simple resistance to change. Jonathan nodded once. "Good. Then let's move forward." He turned toward Richard. "I want a hiring initiative launched immediately. We're bringing in fresh talent, people who understand the level of professionalism we expect, and we'll be reevaluating existing staff." Richard jotted something down, then paused. "How many new hires are we looking at?" Jonathan's gaze swept across the room before he answered. "Enough to make it clear that we're serious." There was another shift of unease. Some employees sat up straighter. Others exchanged quiet glances, suddenly realizing that this wasn't just a warning, it was a restructuring. Jonathan looked toward Lisa. "Lisa." She stiffened slightly. "Yes, sir? You showed integrity when others didn't." That's not something I take lightly. He folded his hands together. I'd like to offer you the position of floor supervisor. You'll work directly with management to ensure these changes are enforced. Lisa blinked. A murmur passed through the room. She hesitated. I appreciate that. But I'm not offering it because you've done it before. Jonathan interrupted. I'm offering it because I need people who care about the right things. Lisa swallowed. The weight of the moment pressed on her. But she forced herself to meet Jonathan's gaze. I won't let you down, she said. Jonathan gave a slight nod. I know you won't. The meeting concluded shortly after. Employees rising from their chairs. Conversations unfolding in hushed voices. Some seemed hopeful, others wary. Mike lingered near the back, watching as Lisa spoke quietly with Evelyn Grant. One of the other bartenders nudged him. So, what now? Mike's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. He thinks he can just flip a switch and change everything overnight. His colleague frowned, and Mike's eyes glinted. We'll see how long that lasts. Chapter 4. The Threat from Within. 2 weeks had passed since the overhaul at Noir Luxe began, and though resistance had lingered in the early days, the changes were starting to take hold. Lisa had stepped into her new role with a quiet determination, ensuring that the standards Jonathan set were upheld. Customers who had once felt neglected now noticed the difference. Drinks arrived promptly. Staff remained attentive, and the air of exclusivity had shifted toward one of genuine hospitality. Of course, not everyone embraced the change. Some of the veteran employees resented being forced into a new way of working. Believing that the bar had lost its identity, they followed the rules, but there was an undercurrent of reluctance. Lisa could feel it every time she walked past certain groups of staff on break. Their hushed conversations stopping abruptly when she was near. Then, one evening, Noir Luxe found itself at the center of an unexpected controversy. A group of high-profile guests had arrived at the bar, the kind who expected nothing short of perfection. They occupied the corner booth, enjoying expensive whiskey and cigars, until one of them, an investment banker with deep ties to the hotel industry, called over a server with a sharp wave of his hand. This is unacceptable, the man said, holding up his glass. Your whiskey has been watered down. I don't pay $1,000 a bottle for this nonsense. The accusation was enough to bring the entire floor to a standstill. Conversations dimmed as nearby patrons turned their heads. The server stammered an apology, offering to replace the drink, but the VIP wasn't interested in substitutions. I want to speak to your manager, he demanded. Now, Lisa arrived at the scene in minutes, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened carefully, then signaled for the bartender on duty to pour a fresh glass from a new bottle right in front of the customer. The man swirled the liquid in his glass, took a slow sip, and frowned. Better, he muttered, but that doesn't change the fact that the first drink was a joke. This bar has gone downhill. His complaint didn't end with Lisa. Within an hour, hotel management had received a direct call from the regional director, demanding an explanation for the alleged decline in quality. And just like that, Jonathan found himself being summoned to account for the state of Noir Luxe. When Jonathan arrived the next morning, he wasn't in the mood for speculation. He called Lisa into his office, along with Richard Caldwell and a few trusted staff members, and got straight to the point. We're investigating this now, he said. I want a full audit of our liquor supply. Every bottle, every invoice, every shipment from the last 3 months. Something doesn't add up. Lisa and a small team spent the next few hours combing through records, cross-referencing deliveries, and physically inspecting the storeroom. It didn't take long before they found what they were looking for. The stock numbers didn't match the inventory. Several high-end whiskey bottles had been replaced with inferior brands, their original labels still intact to deceive anyone who wasn't paying attention. Somewhere along the chain, someone had been swapping the real product for a cheaper substitute, and it hadn't just happened once. Lisa rubbed her temples, feeling a headache form. This wasn't an accident, she said. Someone's been doing this intentionally. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. And someone's been profiting from it. They needed to narrow down the suspects. The list of employees with access to the storeroom wasn't long, and after reviewing security logs, only one name stood out. Mike. Lisa's stomach tightened. She thought back to a few nights ago when she had seen him in the back hallway, speaking in hushed tones with a couple of other veteran employees. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, those conversations took on a different meaning. Jonathan wasted no time. He found Mike in the break room, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, chatting with another bartender. As soon as he noticed Jonathan's approach, his smirk flickered, just for a second, before settling back into place. "Got a minute?" Jonathan asked. Mike set his coffee down and shrugged. "Sure, what's this about?" Jonathan led him into a private office and closed the door behind them. He didn't sit, neither did Mike. "We found inconsistencies in the liquor inventory," Jonathan said simply. "High-end bottles replaced with lower quality stock. The logs show that you've had access to the storeroom more than anyone else in the past few weeks." Mike tilted his head slightly, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "And?" Jonathan folded his arms. "And I want to know if you have anything to say about it." Mike chuckled under his breath. "You think I did this? I think you're one of the few people who could have." Mike held Jonathan's gaze for a long moment, then let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. "Look, I know you don't like me, but I'm not stupid enough to get myself fired over some cheap whiskey scam." "Cheap whiskey wasn't the problem," Jonathan countered. "It was about making Noir Luxe look bad, undermining everything we've been working to fix." Mike's jaw tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. "You think a few training sessions can change everything overnight?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "This bar was built on exclusivity. People came here for a certain atmosphere. And now, you're turning it into something it's not. Some of us don't see that as an improvement." Jonathan's expression didn't change. "I don't care about how things used to be. I care about how they should be." Mike studied him for a moment longer, then smirked. "You've got a lot of faith in people, Jonathan. And you don't," Jonathan replied. "That's why you'll never be the one making decisions here." Mike exhaled sharply through his nose, amused. "Well, then, I guess we'll see where your way takes this place." Jonathan didn't blink. "We will." Mike turned to leave, pausing just before the door. He looked over his shoulder and flashed a smile, not friendly, not entirely mocking, but something unreadable in between. "Good luck with your little experiment," he said. Then, he was gone. Lisa appeared a few moments later. "Did he admit to anything?" "No," Jonathan said, "but we both know he's involved." She nodded, frowning. "So what now?" Jonathan leaned against the desk, looking toward the window. Outside, the city bustled as if nothing had changed. But inside these walls, he knew a storm was brewing. "We need more than training," he said. "We need to find out who's pulling the strings." Chapter 5. The scheme behind the curtain. Jonathan sat in his office, the dim glow of the city skyline stretching beyond the glass windows. The room was quiet, save for the occasional sound of papers shuffling as he reviewed the latest reports. The inconsistencies in Noir Luxe's liquor inventory had become too blatant to ignore. Someone was tampering with the supply chain. And it wasn't just about swapping a few bottles, this was systematic, deliberate, and calculated. He picked up the phone and dialed Lisa. When she answered, he didn't waste time. "I need a full audit of every liquor shipment from the past 3 months. Find every invoice, every supplier, every discrepancy. We're not just looking for mistakes, we're looking for manipulation." Lisa's voice was steady. "I'll get started right away." The following morning, Lisa and a small team gathered in the storeroom, sorting through stacks of paperwork and digital records. Hours passed as they cross-checked numbers, highlighting discrepancies. Some shipments showed incorrect volumes. Others had been recorded at significantly lower costs than their actual market value. Lisa frowned as she flipped through a set of invoices. "These suppliers. Have we ever worked with them before?" One of the junior accountants, a quiet but meticulous woman named Sarah, shook her head. Noir Luxe always had a consistent list of distributors. But these names? They only appeared in the last few months. Lisa picked up a bottle from the latest shipment and turned it in her hands. The label looked identical to the premium brand Noir Luxe stocked. But when she uncorked it and took a careful sniff, her stomach tightened. "It's not the same," she murmured. Jonathan arrived shortly after, taking in the stacks of paperwork spread across the table. Lisa handed him the most concerning invoices. Someone's pocketing the difference, she said. They order cheaper liquor, relabel it, and charge Noir Lux for the premium stuff. The excess money? It's going somewhere. Jonathan exhaled, his jaw tightening, which means someone inside is working with an outside supplier. His suspicions pointed in one direction. Mike. Lisa hesitated. If it is him, he's not working alone. Jonathan nodded. Then let's find out who's helping him. Later that afternoon, Jonathan called for a meeting with the hotel's finance director. He requested a deep dive into every transaction linked to Noir Lux's bar supply. Within an hour, the findings confirmed their fears. Several payments had been routed to an unlisted supplier, one that hadn't been vetted through the usual procurement channels. When Jonathan saw the name on the reports, something clicked. Daniel Cross, a former storeroom manager, fired 3 months ago after an internal investigation into missing stock. A name that, up until now, had been buried in past problems. Mike was close to Daniel before he left. Lisa said, if Daniel set this up after he got fired, Mike might be helping him from the inside. Jonathan didn't waste time. He called for Mike to meet with him and Richard Caldwell, the hotel's general manager. When Mike walked in, he looked relaxed, even amused. What's this about? He asked as he took a seat across from Jonathan. Jonathan slid a document across the table. Recognize this supplier? Mike barely glanced at it. Should I? Jonathan leaned forward. Daniel Cross has been selling subpar liquor to Noir Lux under a shell company. Our records show that he started right after he was fired, and the only person in this hotel who still had regular contact with him was you. Mike exhaled through his nose, shaking his head with a smirk. That's a nice theory, Jonathan, but I'm a bartender. I don't place the orders. I don't sign the invoices. How exactly am I running this operation? Jonathan didn't blink. You didn't need to. Someone placed those orders for you. Mike tilted his head, considering that. Then, after a pause, he shrugged. Sounds like a problem for your accounting department. Not me. The air in the room shifted. Jonathan knew Mike wasn't going to admit anything. Not yet, but there was something in his posture, a confidence that suggested he didn't believe Jonathan could touch him. You've been working here long enough to know how things used to run, Jonathan said, but things are different now. If you're involved in this, I'll find out, and when I do, you won't just be losing a job, you'll be answering for it legally. Mike's lips twitched into something resembling a grin. He stood up, adjusting his sleeves. Well then, good luck with that. That night, as Jonathan tried to piece together the missing links, his phone buzzed. A notification. An article had just been published in one of the city's top business journals. The headline made his stomach drop. Noir Lux's reputation takes a hit. Premium bar accused of watering down high-end liquor. Jonathan's grip on the phone tightened. Moments later, his office line rang. It was the regional director. I need you to explain why the hell Noir Lux is making headlines for the wrong reasons. The voice on the other end snapped. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly before answering. I'll handle it. He hung up and exhaled slowly. Lisa knocked on the door. You saw it? Jonathan nodded. His voice was calm, but the sharp edge beneath it was unmistakable. Someone is trying to destroy everything we're building, he said, and we're going to find out who. Chapter 6. The Puppet Master in the Shadows. The fallout from the article spread faster than Jonathan had anticipated. Overnight, Noir Lux became the subject of heated discussions in business circles and online forums. Customers who once prided themselves on being regulars now arrived with skeptical glances. Some asking pointed questions about the quality of their drinks. A few even canceled their reservations entirely. At Sterling Grand's executive boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. Seated around the long table were key members of the hotel's leadership, including Richard Caldwell, Evelyn Grant, and several senior staff members from Noir Lux. Jonathan stood at the head of the table, his hands resting firmly on the polished wood. We need to control the narrative before it controls us, he said. This article wasn't just an attack on Noir Lux, it was calculated. Someone wants this place to fail, and they're using the press to make it happen. Richard adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. Damage control is possible, but we need something concrete. A public statement denying the claims won't be enough. We need proof. Jonathan nodded. That's why we're launching a full internal investigation. We're auditing every supplier, every shipment, every transaction related to Noir Luxe over the last 6 months. Evelyn frowned. That'll take time. Then we work quickly, Jonathan said, because if we don't get ahead of this, the next headline won't be about a single bar. It'll be about the entire Sterling Grand brand. The meeting ended with clear directives. Lisa was tasked with overseeing inventory verification, while the finance team was ordered to review every questionable transaction. Jonathan, however, had a feeling that the answers wouldn't come from paperwork alone. Someone within the company was orchestrating this, and he needed to find out who. Later that evening, Lisa sat in Noir Luxe's back office, cross-checking shipment records, when her phone buzzed with a new message. The number was unfamiliar. "Stop digging if you want to keep your job." She stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. The message had no signature, no further details, just a warning. She immediately forwarded it to Jonathan. Moments later, her phone rang. Where did this come from? His voice was sharp, controlled. "No idea," she admitted. "It's a blocked number." Jonathan wasted no time. He called the hotel's IT department, requesting a trace on the message. An hour later, one of the tech specialists, Mark, entered his office with a laptop in hand. "We tracked the IP address," Mark said, pulling up the data. "It's been masked through a few proxies, but the origin leads back to a device once registered to the hotel's internal network." Jonathan leaned forward. "Where?" Mark tapped the screen. "It was last connected in the Noir Luxe storage room. More specifically, it was linked to a company account previously assigned to a former employee, Daniel Cross." Jonathan's stomach tightened. A name that had surfaced once before during the liquor fraud investigation. A name tied to missing shipments and suspicious transactions. A man who, until now, was believed to have simply left the company. Jonathan immediately pulled up Daniel's personnel file. According to the official report, Daniel had resigned 3 months ago. But as he flipped through the documents, one detail stood out. Daniel hadn't quit. He had been terminated. A separate internal report revealed the reason. An audit had uncovered financial discrepancies, leading to his dismissal, and the person who had signed off on his termination. Jonathan exhaled, his mind racing. Mike had seemed like a problem from the start, but now it was clear, he wasn't the mastermind. He was a piece in someone else's game. Lisa knocked on the door, stepping inside cautiously. "Did you find something?" Jonathan nodded, rubbing his jaw. Daniel Cross was fired for fraud, and Mike was the one who pushed him out. Lisa's eyes widened. "So he's behind everything?" Jonathan shook his head. If Daniel was running this, why send a threat now? If anything, he should be lying low. Someone else is calling the shots. Someone higher up. Lisa's expression darkened. "Then who?" Before Jonathan could answer, his computer chimed with a new email. The sender was anonymous. There was no subject line, no introduction, just a single sentence staring back at him. "You can't change Noir Luxe. If you keep trying, you'll be the next to go." Jonathan read it twice, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. Whoever was behind this wasn't just protecting an old system. They were willing to eliminate anyone who stood in their way. Chapter 7. The Exposed Link. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the email on his screen. The words burned in his mind, not just as a threat but as a declaration of war. Someone inside the hotel wanted him out of Noir Luxe, and they were willing to use any means necessary. This wasn't just about a few fraudulent liquor shipments or an old employee with a grudge. This was bigger. He knew he couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Whoever was behind this had influence, possibly beyond just Noir Luxe. If he involved law enforcement too soon, the real mastermind would simply disappear, leaving behind a few disposable pawns. No, he needed to play this carefully. He needed to draw them out. Jonathan picked up his phone and dialed Lisa. "Meet me in my office in 15 minutes. Bring Mark from IT with you." Lisa arrived promptly, followed by Mark, who carried a laptop under his arm. Jonathan gestured for them to sit as he turned the screen toward them. "I need you to trace this." Mark adjusted his glasses as he leaned in, fingers flying over the keyboard. "It's routed through a virtual network to hide the origin," he murmured. "But give me a second." He squinted at the screen. Then his brows shot up. Got something? Lisa leaned forward. Already? Mark nodded. They made a mistake. Whoever sent this didn't mask their IP address completely. It was relayed through an internal network. Jonathan's jaw tightened. You're saying this was sent from inside the hotel? Mark exhaled, rubbing his chin. Not just the hotel. Noir Lux. Lisa glanced at Jonathan, her expression mirroring his own thoughts. The enemy wasn't outside, they were still inside. Operating in plain sight. Jonathan looked at Lisa. We need eyes on everything. Watch the employees. Pay attention to who stays late. Who talks to who. I don't want rumors, I want facts. Lisa nodded. I'll keep it discreet. With that, she left, and Jonathan turned his attention to another task. He pressed a button on his phone. Calling the front desk. Send Mike to my office. Minutes later, Mike stepped in, his usual smirk slightly dimmed. He took a seat across from Jonathan. His posture relaxed, but there was something else, something guarded. Jonathan didn't waste time. He turned the screen toward him. Recognize this? Mike glanced at the email. Then back at Jonathan. What do you want me to say? That you didn't write it. Mike leaned back, crossing his arms. I didn't. Jonathan studied him for a moment. But you know who did. There was a flicker of something in Mike's expression. But he didn't speak. Jonathan continued. Daniel Cross wasn't acting alone. He was a piece of something larger. Who else is involved? Mike's lips curled into a knowing smile. You think Noir Lux is just a bar? He exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. It's bigger than that. Jonathan leaned forward. Then explain it to me. Mike didn't answer. Instead, he stood, stretching slightly as if the conversation had bored him. Be careful, Jonathan. Some things in this place have been running a certain way for a long time. You start pulling the wrong thread, the whole thing might come down on you. Jonathan didn't move. He simply watched as Mike turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, Mike glanced over his shoulder. I'll say one thing, if you really want answers. Stop looking at the employees. Look at the people in charge. With that, he was gone. That night, Lisa returned to Jonathan's office with new information. One of the bartenders came to me. She said some of the senior staff have been meeting in the VIP lounge after hours. No customers, no regular staff, just them. Jonathan frowned. How many people? She couldn't say for sure. But she knows it's been happening for a while. Jonathan tapped his fingers against the desk. He needed to be in that room. Needed to see who was orchestrating this from the inside. A plan formed in his mind. I need a uniform, he said. For one night, I'm going in as staff. Lisa hesitated. You sure about that? Jonathan nodded. They won't show their hand unless they think no one is watching. If this bar is more than just a bar, I need to find out what's really going on. What Jonathan didn't know was that someone was already watching. Someone who had been anticipating his every move. Chapter 8. Battle in the dark. The main floor of Noir Lux had emptied out, leaving only the low hum of the refrigeration units and the faint scent of whiskey lingering in the air. The last guests had departed an hour ago, yet a select group remained behind, gathered in the dimly lit VIP lounge. Jonathan stood near the back of the bar, blending into the shadows in his borrowed server's uniform. From his vantage point, he could see familiar faces, bartenders and supervisors he recognized from his tenure at Sterling Grand. But then, his gaze locked onto someone he hadn't expected to see. Robert Hale. Jonathan's grip on the tray in his hands tightened slightly. Hale was the regional director for Sterling Grand, a man who rarely concerned himself with the daily operations of any single hotel. His presence here, at this hour, wasn't just unusual, it was a red flag. Hale leaned back in a leather chair, swirling a glass of cognac in his hand as he spoke in a low, measured tone. Noir Lux was never meant to be a simple bar, he said. It's a conduit, a discreet mechanism for redistributing assets without attracting unwanted attention. Jonathan's stomach turned. He had suspected corruption within the ranks, but hearing it confirmed so casually sent a wave of cold realization through him. The setup was painfully clear now. Noir Lux wasn't just an overpriced watering hole for the elite. It was a financial laundering operation buried within Sterling Grand itself. Hale and his associates were manipulating liquor orders, falsifying invoices, and using the bar's exclusivity as a front to clean illicit money. One of the men in the room, a broad-shouldered figure in a suit, nodded. And the recent issues? Hale smirked, taking a slow sip from his glass. A necessary inconvenience. Public perception had to shift. The complaints, the bad press, they help us justify intervening and taking over the bar's operations completely. Once we do, we'll be able to run things without any interference. Jonathan steadied his breathing. Hale had orchestrated everything. The watered-down liquor, the supplier fraud, even the media smear campaign. It was all a controlled descent, ensuring that Noir Lux's reputation crumbled just enough for him to seize total control. Jonathan reached into his pocket, discreetly pressing a button on his phone. The audio recording feature was already running. Once we finalize the transition, we'll bring in our own people. Hale continued. No more leaks, no more surprises. Jonathan knew he had enough. He needed to get out. He turned, careful not to make a sound as he began backing toward the exit. But just as he reached the doorway, his heel clipped against the edge of a chair leg. A sharp, wooden scrape echoed through the room. The conversation inside stopped. Hale's voice hardened. Who's there? Jonathan froze for a split second before pivoting swiftly, slipping out of the VIP lounge and moving toward the service hallway. Behind him, hurried footsteps followed, and a second later, a voice barked out, "Find them." He kept moving, keeping his pace controlled so as not to draw immediate attention. If he ran, it would confirm his guilt. He just needed to reach the staff exit. Then, suddenly, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Jonathan spun around, but before he could react, he found himself face to face with Mike. The bartender's expression was unreadable at first, but then, a slow smile crept across his lips. "Looks like you walked into the wrong room," Mike said quietly. Jonathan didn't respond, his mind racing for an exit. Mike's grip tightened just slightly. "You really thought you could just waltz in here and listen in?" Footsteps approached fast. Hale's men were closing in. Then, Mike leaned in, lowering his voice. "Follow my lead," he murmured. Jonathan barely had time to process those words before Mike shoved him hard against the wall. Just as the others arrived, found him sneaking around, Mike announced, his tone sharp but his eyes sending an unspoken message. Hale stepped forward, his expression darkening. He studied Jonathan for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. "Well," Hale said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "That's unfortunate." Jonathan said nothing, his pulse steady even as he braced for what was coming next. Chapter 9. Trapped. The air inside Noir Lux was heavy, thick with the remnants of expensive cigars and aged liquor. The main floor was silent, save for the occasional clink of glass being wiped down by the last remaining staff. But in the VIP lounge, behind a door that had just been locked from the inside, a different kind of silence settled, a tense, suffocating one. Jonathan stood in the center of the room, his posture composed, though his pulse pounded beneath the surface. Mike stood beside him, hands in his pockets, while two other men, both Noir Lux employees Jonathan barely recognized, flanked the door. And then, stepping forward with deliberate ease, was Robert Hale. Hale's expression was unreadable at first, but as his gaze settled on Jonathan, a slow, knowing smile formed. "Well," Hale said, crossing his arms, "the great CEO of Sterling Grand, sneaking around like a common thief. I have to say, Jonathan, I expected better." Jonathan didn't flinch. He had spent years negotiating with men like Hale. Men who wielded power not with brute force but with well-placed words and carefully timed decisions. He knew the only way out of this situation was to control the narrative. "I like to keep a close eye on my investments," Jonathan said smoothly. "Noir Lux is still part of my hotel. Last I checked." Mike let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Looks like trust is a real issue for you, boss." Hale exchanged a glance with Mike before nodding. Mike took a step forward, reaching into Jonathan's pocket and pulling out his phone. He glanced at the screen, then turned it so Hale could see. A recording was still running. Jonathan kept his face neutral as Hale took the device from Mike's hand, examining it with quiet amusement. The room felt smaller now, the air thinner. "You've been busy," Hale murmured, tapping the screen, "listening in on conversations you weren't invited to." Not exactly the behavior of a CEO. He turned the phone over in his hand, then slid it into his own pocket. Jonathan met his gaze. You're not going to destroy that. Hale's smirk didn't fade. No? If you do, that tells me you're afraid of what's on it. A pause. A flicker of amusement in Hale's eyes. Clever, he admitted, but the problem isn't the recording. Jonathan, the problem is that you know things you shouldn't. And that puts us in a very inconvenient position. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He could feel it now, the shift in the room. The way the walls seemed to close in just slightly. The men by the door hadn't moved. But they didn't have to. Their presence was enough. Hale exhaled, almost theatrically. So, let's be practical about this. You have two options. He took a step closer. His tone light but edged with steel. 1. You walk out of here and forget everything you've heard tonight. Noir Lux continues to run as it has. And you focus on the parts of your empire that actually matter. Jonathan didn't speak. He already knew what was coming next. Or, Hale continued, you don't, and that, my friend, would be problematic. Mike reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his own phone. He tapped the screen, then turned it toward Jonathan. It was a photograph. Jonathan's stomach twisted the moment he saw it. Margaret, his sister, standing outside her bookstore, a soft smile on her face as she locked up for the night. A seemingly innocent image, except for the implication behind it. Someone had been watching her. His hands curled into fists at his sides. But he kept his voice level. You're threatening my family? Hale let out a soft chuckle. Threatening? No, Jonathan. I'm just making sure you understand what's at stake. He tilted his head slightly. Watching him, you don't strike me as the reckless type. I imagine you care about the people in your life. So why not make the smart choice here? Jonathan's heart pounded, but his expression remained unreadable. He had spent years building his career on control over negotiations, over boardroom dynamics, over crisis management. Now, that control was slipping through his fingers. Hale took another step forward, patting Jonathan's shoulder lightly. I'll give you until tomorrow to decide. But I have a feeling you'll make the right call. Jonathan didn't move as the door unlocked behind him. Mike gestured toward the exit with an easy smirk. See you around, boss. Without a word, Jonathan stepped past them, walking out of the lounge and into the empty bar. The weight of the situation pressed against his chest. But his mind was already moving. Calculating. He had less than 24 hours. And he had just realized the real battle hadn't even begun. Chapter 10. Turning the tide. Morning light filtered through the windows of Jonathan's office at Sterling Grand's headquarters, casting long shadows across the polished oak desk. He sat motionless, staring at the city skyline, his mind running through every possibility. Robert Hale hadn't just threatened him, he had proven that he had been watching for a long time. The fact that Hale knew about Margaret, someone who had nothing to do with the hotel or Noir Lux, meant that this wasn't just about business. It was personal. A soft knock broke the silence. Lisa stepped in, her expression tight with concern. Are you okay? She asked. Jonathan exhaled slowly. We need to be faster than them. He turned to his computer and started issuing orders. If Hale thought he could scare him into silence, he was wrong. Jonathan wasn't going to run. He was going to fight back. Lisa sat down across from him as he laid out his plan. The first step was information. Start digging into Noir Lux's financial records. Jonathan instructed. Every transaction, every supplier, every wire transfer linked to Robert Hale. I don't care how far back it goes, find something. Lisa nodded but hesitated. Even if we find something, how do we use it? Hale has connections. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Then we find someone with a bigger spotlight. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he landed on a name, Daniel Morris. A well-respected investigative journalist. Morris had built a career exposing corporate corruption. He was relentless and, more importantly, incorruptible. Jonathan hit the call button. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Jonathan Price. Didn't think I'd be hearing from you again. I have a story for you, Jonathan said, one that leads straight to Robert Hale. There was a pause. Then Morris spoke again, his tone sharper. Go on. As Jonathan laid out the pieces, Lisa's phone buzzed. She glanced down and her breath hitched. I think we just found something, she murmured. She turned her laptop around, showing Jonathan a newly uncovered financial report. Hidden beneath layers of transactions was a company name neither of them had seen before. Blackwood Holdings. On paper, it was a private investment firm. But after some digging, Lisa uncovered what it really was, a shell company, used to launder money through Noir Lux's operations. And the registered owner? Jonathan leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. We have him. But having proof wasn't enough. He needed to use it strategically. If he moved too soon, Hale would bury the evidence. If he waited too long, Hale might make his next move first. That's when the idea came to him. He turned back to Lisa. Set up a meeting with Hale. Tell him I want to talk. Lisa frowned. You think he'll believe that? Jonathan allowed himself a small, cold smile. He will if I make him think he's won. By evening, Jonathan arrived at Noir Lux, dressed in his usual tailored suit but carrying something far more dangerous than a business proposal. He walked through the familiar halls, past patrons sipping overpriced cocktails, until he reached the VIP section. Hale was already there, sitting comfortably with a glass of bourbon in hand. He looked up as Jonathan entered, his expression unreadable but undeniably pleased. I knew you'd come back, Hale mused. You strike me as a reasonable man. Jonathan took a seat across from him. He let a measured silence fill the space before speaking. I've thought about what you said, Jonathan began, keeping his voice even, and I have a proposal. Hale raised an eyebrow, intrigued. I'm listening. Jonathan pulled out his phone, placed it on the table, and turned the screen toward Hale. Displayed on the screen was an unsent email, addressed to Daniel Morris. Attached were documents, transaction logs, and proof of Hale's financial manipulation. A single press of the button, and Hale's entire operation would be public knowledge. All it takes is one tap, Jonathan said quietly, and your name is on every front page by morning. For the first time, Hale's smirk faltered. He studied the phone, his mind likely racing through his options. Then, after a long moment, he leaned back and exhaled through his nose. I have to admit, you play a good game, Jonathan. He lifted his glass and took a slow sip. But tell me, are you sure you've accounted for everything? The words sent a ripple of unease through Jonathan's chest. Before he could react, the door behind him swung open. Two men stepped inside, both dressed in dark suits. Their expressions unreadable. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing Jonathan inside the room. Hale set his drink down gently. It looks like we have a little more to discuss, he said, his tone dangerously smooth. Jonathan didn't move, but he could feel the weight of the situation shifting. He had played his hand, but now Hale was playing his. And the next move could determine everything. Chapter 11. The Death Game. The air inside Noir Lux's VIP lounge felt heavier than usual, charged with an unspoken challenge between the two men at the center of the room. Jonathan sat motionless, his gaze locked onto Robert Hale, who lounged comfortably in his chair, swirling the last remnants of his drink. Behind Jonathan, two of Hale's men stood firm, their presence a silent warning. The door was shut, no exits. Hale broke the silence first. I have to admit, Jonathan, he mused, tilting his glass slightly, I underestimated you. You're not just another corporate figurehead, are you? Jonathan remained unreadable. If that's what you thought, then you weren't paying attention. Hale smirked, leaning forward. But here's the problem. You think one little exposé is enough to take me down? That's not how the world works. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, sliding it across the table. Go ahead, he said smoothly. Take a look. Jonathan hesitated for half a second before flipping it open. His eyes scanned the pages, and his stomach tightened. Financial records, transaction histories, but not Hale's, his own. Documents, emails, and financial statements, falsified, but disturbingly detailed, accusing Jonathan of embezzling funds from Sterling Grand, using Noir Lux as a front for tax evasion. Jonathan forced himself to remain calm. You've been planning this for a while, he said. Hale smiled. I always have a contingency plan. If you go public with that article, if you try to take me down, I'll make sure these documents hit the press first. You won't be the hero, Jonathan. You'll be the fall guy. Jonathan closed the folder, pressing his fingers against the cover as if absorbing the weight of the decision before him. Hale wasn't bluffing. If these documents were released, even a fraction of the public would believe them. And in a world where reputation was everything, it wouldn't matter if he was innocent, the damage would be done. Hale stood up, circling the table like a predator assessing its prey. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to step away from Noir Lux. Publicly state that the rumors about corruption were exaggerated. Say that you have full confidence in my leadership. And in return, this little problem of yours disappears. Jonathan flexed his fingers beneath the table, calculating. Hale was too comfortable, too sure of himself. There had to be a way out. Then, Jonathan's phone vibrated in his pocket. A single, urgent message from Lisa. Turn on the news. Now. Keeping his movements steady, Jonathan reached for the remote on the table and switched on the television mounted on the lounge's wall. The room filled with the voice of a news anchor. An ongoing federal investigation into illicit financial activities across high-end hospitality chains. Authorities have confirmed a large-scale money laundering scheme involving multiple luxury establishments. The screen shifted to a set of images, individuals being led into custody by FBI agents. Jonathan's pulse quickened as he recognized one of the faces. One of Hale's key players. Jonathan turned back to Hale just in time to see his carefully composed expression falter. Seems like your little empire isn't as secure as you thought, Jonathan said, his voice cool. Hale's hands tightened at his sides. But he recovered quickly, giving a forced chuckle. You really think this changes anything? Cross was sloppy. I made sure my name isn't attached to anything. Jonathan held up his phone. Maybe not yet, but give it a few hours. Hale's smile didn't reach his eyes. The tension in the room shifted. One of Hale's men stepped forward slightly, muscles tensing, waiting for a signal, but Hale held up a hand, stopping him. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then, Hale exhaled slowly, shaking his head. This isn't over, Jonathan, he said, voice low. Jonathan pocketed his phone and stood up. No, but this is the beginning of the end for you. He walked toward the door. And this time, the guards didn't stop him. As he stepped out into the hallway, the weight of what had just happened settled over him. This wasn't the endgame, but for the first time, the advantage had shifted, and Jonathan Price was ready to play for keeps. Chapter 12. The Decisive Counterattack. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Sterling Grand's executive conference room, casting long shadows across the polished table. Jonathan sat at the head, his expression calm but unwavering. Around him, his most trusted allies had gathered: Lisa, investigative journalist Daniel Morris, and a high-profile attorney representing the hotel chain. Time was running out. The FBI was already circling Robert Hale. But Jonathan knew that wasn't enough. If they wanted to take him down completely, they needed to make sure there was no escape route. Hale was too connected, too entrenched in corporate corruption to go down without a fight. We need a clean kill, Jonathan said, his voice steady. A single, decisive blow before he can cover his tracks. Lisa adjusted her laptop, the glow of her screen reflecting in her focused eyes. We've already tracked multiple offshore accounts linked to Blackwood Holdings, she said. Some of them funnel money directly through Noir Lux. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Carter, folded her hands. That's strong evidence, but it won't hold unless we can tie Hale directly to those transactions. Jonathan turned to Daniel. How fast can you get a full exposé ready? Daniel leaned back, rubbing his chin. The article itself is done. But if we release it now, Hale could still try to spin the narrative. We need a public scandal. Something undeniable. Jonathan nodded. That's where the FBI comes in. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he landed on the name he had been waiting to use. Special Agent Thomas Greer. Greer had been investigating corporate fraud for years. If there was anyone who could make sure Hale had no way out, it was him. Jonathan pressed the call button. When Greer picked up, his voice was clipped. Professional. Price. I assume you have something for me. Jonathan glanced at Lisa. Then Daniel. I have more than enough, he said, but I need your guarantee. When this goes public, Hale doesn't get a chance to slip through the cracks. Greer was silent for a beat. Then, meet me in 1 hour. Jonathan ended the call, exhaling slowly. "This is it," he said. "One way or another, we ended today." Lisa's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. "It's one of Hale's men," she whispered. Jonathan motioned for her to answer. A rough voice came through the speaker. "I don't have much time. Hale's already moving. He knows something's coming." Lisa exchanged a look with Jonathan. "What do you mean?" "He's cutting loose ends. He's planning to pin everything on Mike and Daniel Cross." Jonathan's grip on the table tightened. He had expected Hale to turn on his people eventually. But this confirmed something even more important. Hale was getting desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. Jonathan stood. "We're using this." An hour later, in a private suite at Sterling Grand, Jonathan sat across from Mike. The bartender turned accomplice looked tense, sweat beading at his temple. Jonathan slid a folder across the table. "Hale is done protecting you," he said evenly. "The moment he feels the walls closing in, you're the first one he'll sacrifice." Mike didn't respond, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed his thoughts. Jonathan continued, his voice calm but firm. "I can get you immunity. You testify. You help bring him down. And you walk away from this with your life intact." Mike exhaled sharply. "And if I don't?" Jonathan's expression darkened. "Then when Hale goes down, you go with him." The room was silent. Then, slowly, Mike reached for the folder, flipping through the documents. His face hardened as he processed the reality of the situation. Finally, he nodded. "Fine, I'll testify." Jonathan leaned back. He had his witness. Within hours, the FBI had Mike's full statement, combined with the financial evidence Lisa uncovered and Daniel's exposé ready to go live. The case against Hale was airtight. Jonathan stood by the window of his office, watching the city below. He could feel it now, the inevitability of Hale's downfall. But he also knew one thing for certain. Hale wasn't the type to go down quietly. Chapter 13. The net closes. The midnight air outside Noir Lux was thick with tension. FBI agents swarmed the premises, their flashlights cutting through the dimly lit corridors as they secured boxes of financial records and hard drives. The once bustling luxury bar was now a crime scene. Officers led away stunned employees, some protesting, others too afraid to speak. News of the federal raid spread like wildfire. Within hours, headlines flooded every major news outlet. The story was no longer a whispered rumor, it was national scandal. At the center of it all, Robert Hale remained eerily silent. But Jonathan knew better than to assume Hale had given up. Hale wasn't the kind of man to go down without a fight. Inside an upscale penthouse on the Upper East Side, Robert Hale poured himself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He leaned back against his desk, staring out at the New York skyline. His empire was collapsing around him. But he refused to panic. Not yet. With his free hand, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. When the line connected, a gravelly voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd call." Hale's grip on his glass tightened. "I need you to slow them down. Long enough for me to disappear." The man on the other end chuckled. "That's not going to be cheap." Hale exhaled sharply. "I don't care what it costs. Just make it happen." He ended the call, setting his phone down. Time was running out. At Sterling Grand's headquarters, Jonathan sat across from Lisa. His eyes locked onto the latest financial reports she had pulled up. "He's moving money," Lisa said, pointing at the screen. "One of his offshore accounts just received a significant transfer. If I had to guess, he's getting ready to run." Jonathan clenched his jaw. Hale wasn't going to wait for an arrest. He was preparing to vanish. Mike's name flashed across Jonathan's phone. He answered immediately. "He's at his penthouse." Mike's voice was low. "Packing up. He's got a flight lined up." Jonathan stood. "We're not letting him get away." He immediately called the FBI. 30 minutes later, Jonathan pulled up outside Hale's penthouse. He wasn't waiting for the authorities to handle this alone. Inside, Hale was nearly finished packing when the front door opened. Jonathan stepped in, his presence filling the room. Hale, standing by a suitcase, smirked. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Jonathan's gaze was steady. "It's over, Hale." Hale exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. "That's where you're wrong." Before Jonathan could respond, the sound of sirens echoed from below. Red and blue lights flashed across the windows. Hale's smirk faltered as he walked to the window, watching as FBI agents swarmed the building. Jonathan crossed his arms. Still think you can talk your way out of this? Hale turned back, his expression dark. You think you've won? Jonathan shook his head. I didn't win. You lost. The front door burst open, and federal agents stormed in. As they placed Hale in handcuffs, he shot Jonathan a venomous glare. This isn't over. Jonathan met his gaze with unwavering calm. For you, it is. Chapter 14. The Fall of Hale. A week had passed since Robert Hale was taken into custody, and the full scale of his crimes was now unraveling in the public eye. The FBI's investigation had confirmed what Jonathan already knew. Noir Lux had been at the center of an elaborate money laundering operation. Orchestrated under Hale's leadership, news outlets ran the story relentlessly, each headline more damning than the last. The scandal sent shockwaves through the hospitality industry, exposing not only Hale's crimes but the broader network of corruption he had carefully cultivated over the years. For Jonathan, it was both a victory and a stark reminder of the rot that had festered beneath the surface of his own company. Hale's arrest set off a chain reaction. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, and his former allies began to distance themselves, scrambling to protect their own interests. The official charges leveled against him were severe: money laundering, wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. If convicted, he was looking at decades behind bars. Mike, who had turned against Hale in the final moments, was granted leniency in exchange for his testimony. Under the Federal Witness Protection Program, he disappeared from public view, his role in the scandal buried under layers of sealed court documents. And then there were the others, the executives, the lawyers, the government officials who had accepted Hale's bribes. As the investigation widened, arrests continued, proving that Noir Lux had been just one cog in a much larger machine. For Jonathan, however, the battle wasn't over yet. Restoring Noir Lux. The fallout from the scandal had left Noir Lux's reputation in shambles. Customers, once drawn in by its exclusivity, now saw it as a symbol of corruption. Employees, uncertain of their futures, whispered anxiously in the hallways. Jonathan wasted no time. A full-scale restructuring began immediately. Every staff member with even the slightest connection to Hale's operations was dismissed. The supply chain was audited, vendor contracts renegotiated, and new oversight policies were implemented. Lisa, whose loyalty and integrity had never wavered, was officially promoted to manager. She would oversee Noir Lux's transformation, ensuring that it was rebuilt on the principles of genuine service and ethical business. We're done with exclusivity for the sake of appearances, Jonathan told her. This place needs to be about quality, not wealth. She nodded. We're going to do things the right way this time. One evening, after the dust had settled, Jonathan returned to Noir Lux, not as its owner, but as a customer. The atmosphere had changed. The artificial pretension was gone, replaced by something more authentic. The service was attentive, warm, professional. Guests were treated with the same courtesy, whether they arrived in designer suits or casual jeans. Lisa spotted him from across the bar and approached with an easy smile. Welcome back, sir. What can I get you? Jonathan considered for a moment before replying. A whiskey. Neat. She nodded and poured the drink herself, setting the glass down in front of him. Jonathan lifted it slowly, taking in the moment. This wasn't just a drink. It was proof that Noir Lux had changed, that it had been salvaged from the corruption that nearly destroyed it. As the whiskey burned smoothly down his throat, Jonathan allowed himself a rare smile. The fight was over, and this time, justice had won. Chapter 15. The Legacy of a Battle. A month had passed since Hale's arrest, and Noir Lux had transformed. The scandal that once threatened to bring down the establishment had instead reshaped it into something better, something real. Lisa stood at the bar, carefully watching as her staff worked. The atmosphere was different now. The air of pretension that once suffocated the place had lifted, replaced by an energy that felt genuine. Customers came not because of exclusivity but because they wanted to be there. In many ways, Noir Lux was unrecognizable from what it had been before, and that was exactly how it should be. While Noir Lux flourished, The same could not be said for Jonathan's position. The fallout from the scandal had made waves beyond the hotel's walls. Sterling Grand's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. Jonathan knew what was coming. Inside the conference room, a long table stretched between him and the other executives. Some faces were familiar allies. Others, skeptical observers. One of the senior board members leaned forward, fingers steepled together. "Jonathan, let's be clear. You exposed Noir Lux's corruption. You removed the rot, but you also risked this company's reputation in the process. Some might argue that a quieter resolution would have been preferable." Jonathan met his gaze without hesitation. And what would that have looked like? Sweeping everything under the rug? Letting Noir Lux continue as a front for criminals while pretending we didn't know? A murmur rippled through the room. Some board members exchanged glances. Others remained stone-faced. "You put your own career on the line." Another voice chimed in. "Are you certain it was worth it?" Jonathan took a breath. "I didn't do this to save my career. I did it to save this company from becoming something it was never meant to be. A hotel isn't just walls and rooms, it's trust. If we turn a blind eye to corruption, then we are no better than Hale." Silence. Then, one by one, heads nodded, some reluctantly, some with conviction. One of the longest-serving board members, a woman who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. "Perhaps we needed this wake-up call." Jonathan knew he had won, not just for himself, but for what Sterling Grand would stand for moving forward. That evening, back in his office, Jonathan sifted through paperwork when his assistant entered with a small envelope. "This was delivered for you. No return address." Jonathan frowned, opening it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper. One sentence. "Noir Lux was only the beginning. There are bigger players still in the dark." Jonathan exhaled slowly, setting the letter down. His mind raced. Who had sent this? And what did they know? He reached for a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid swirling under the dim office light. Outside his window, New York stretched endlessly beyond the glass. A city built on ambition, secrets, and power plays. He had fought one battle, but something told him the war was far from over. Chapter 16. A New Beginning. The newly rebranded Noir Lux was alive with energy. The grand reopening had drawn a mix of longtime patrons and curious newcomers, each eager to see the transformation firsthand. Gone were the days of exclusivity built on arrogance. Tonight, the atmosphere felt different, genuine, welcoming. Lisa stood near the bar, taking it all in. The clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation, the jazz band playing a lively but elegant tune in the background. It was everything Noir Lux was meant to be. And it was finally free from the corruption that once tainted it. She adjusted the collar of her blazer, preparing herself for what came next. The night wasn't just a celebration, it was a statement. Noir Lux was no longer a symbol of power plays and manipulation. It was a testament to change. Jonathan Price watched from a distance, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling in. He had fought hard for this moment, and though the battle had taken its toll, seeing the bar flourish under Lisa's leadership made it all worth it. The lights dimmed slightly as Lisa took the microphone at the small stage near the bar. The crowd quieted, their attention shifting to the new manager. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Lisa began, her voice steady but carrying the weight of everything it had taken to reach this point. "Noir Lux has been through its share of challenges. But tonight, we turn the page. This place isn't just about fine drinks or luxury, it's about people. About community. And about integrity." She glanced toward Jonathan, and he nodded in approval. "Now, let's raise a glass to new beginnings. And to the people who made this possible." Glasses lifted, a ripple of agreement coursing through the room as the toast was met with warm applause. Jonathan stepped forward then, taking a moment to address the room. His words were brief, but they carried weight. "This isn't just a bar. This is proof that honor and honesty still matter. Noir Lux isn't just back, it's stronger than ever." The room erupted in applause once more, but Jonathan barely registered it. His mind was already moving beyond the celebration. As the event began winding down, Jonathan made his way toward the exit, ready to leave Lisa and her team to enjoy the rest of the night. But before he could step outside, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Mr. Price." A voice greeted him, smooth and deliberate. "You think you've cleaned everything up?" Jonathan remained silent, waiting. The voice chuckled. "Noir Lux was just one piece. Did you really think it was the only weak spot in your empire?" Jonathan's grip on his phone tightened. If Noir Lux could be compromised. The voice continued. "How safe do you think the rest of your hotels are?" A slow exhale left Jonathan's lips. He had expected this. Looking back over his shoulder, he saw Noir Lux in its new light, thriving, bustling, free. The fight for justice wasn't over. It was only beginning. And this time, he was ready. At the end of the day, this story isn't just about a rude bartender or a CEO in disguise. It's a powerful reminder that true character is revealed in how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. Respect, integrity, and kindness should never depend on someone's appearance. Because you never know who might be sitting across from you. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed a situation like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love eye-opening stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more hidden revelations.